What's the matter, Richard? You should be glad to be back in the Something Who bunker.
The bunker isn't my home, Paul. I'm a podcaster.
Ooh, we know you're a podcaster.
So are we.
You don't understand the implications. I edit this podcast. I walk in eternity.
Oh, what's that supposed to mean?
It means that it feels like I've been editing it for something like 750 years.
And you are already very ancient.
Perhaps it's time we find something better to do than compare Doctor Who stories.
That thing! It looked like the face of Sutekh.
Some vast impulse of energy has drawn us back through history.
You're saying this is the bunker, but years before we knew it?
Yes.
But it's so different. It can't be the same place.
It must be the old studio. The Something Who bunker was built on the site.
Maybe Sutekh is forcing us to compare his story with something modern.
Oh, can't we just dial up 1980 on the podcast timeline and leave?
When?
1980? That's when we're from, isn't it?
We can't.
Why not?
Because if Sutekh isn't stopped, he'll destroy the podcast.
But he didn't, did he? I mean, we know the podcast hasn't ended.
Do we?
Yes, of course we do.
All right. If we leave now, let's hear what the podcast will sound like in 1980.
It's a trick.
No, that's the podcast as Sutekh would leave it, a desolate sound wave on a dead server.
It can't be. I'm from 1980.
Are you sure?
Well, I'm flattering myself a bit, but, thereabouts.
Can we change the course of history?
To a small extent. Maybe if we like Pyramids of Mars more than the modern equivalent, Sutekh will pester another podcast instead.
So we've got to finish the recording?
Yes.
Oh, bugger.
When?
Or when?
When?
When? When? When? When? When? When?
That'll do.
No, you've done it right several times. Everyone was laughing.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast where we take something old, a Doctor Who story from the original series, compare it with something new, one from the new series, and add something borrowed, that sketch, to make Something Who. Yes, it's Something Who podcast episode 46. I'm Richard, and we're back with another look at a couple of Doctor Who stories. And the first one is Fourth Doctor tale, Pyramids of Mars from season 13. And after that, we discuss 12th Doctor story, Mummy on the Orient Express from Series 8. So with me to discuss mummies and malign controlling presences are Big Finish author and Missing Episodes podcaster Paul. Hello, Paul.
Good evening, all.
Science and astronomy writer Giles.
I've got a cold.
Oh. And making up our quartet, it's graphic designer and half of Dalek 63 to 88, Gav.
When? Hello.
So incidentally, Gav, which half are you? Are you the skirt section with the balls or the top bit with the eye stalk, gun and sucker?
All balls.
That's a very personal question to ask the young man, Richard.
I was looking at that picture of, was it Power of the Daleks, where they're sort of sitting in the bottom half of the Daleks with the top half missing. No, not top half's on the floor beside them or something like that. Provoked that thought. Anyway, so let's start with Pyramids of Mars, which was written by Stephen Harris, or as we know him, Robert Holmes, and directed by Paddy Russell. And this is the third of the three extant Paddy Russell stories that we've looked at on Something Who, and we enjoyed the other two. And for all we know, the Massacre was great too, so let's see what we think of this one. And, well, I mean, here's something novel for you. I have actually seen this story since it was broadcast. In fact, this one comes bang in the middle of my period as a young fan. So I was 7, just on the verge of being 8. and loving Doctor Who when it came on. I was reading Target books and getting Weetabix cards. I mean, how much Weetabix did I eat that year? And I was about to receive my first Doctor Who annual. I guess probably watched it mostly on the VHS version, which came out in the mid-80s. I mean, I did watch it for this, obviously, but I mean, I could probably almost have recited it from those many viewings. Your histories maybe with Pyramids of Mars?
Well, I was on holiday once and we went to this quarry. No, nothing interesting. I suppose it would have been the VHS release. Yes. Having already read the book.
Yeah.
Yes, I read the book exhaustively many, many times over. Being a bit of a Egypt nut anyway, as young boys often are. Yes, and then eventually I must have caught up with it on VHS at some... I'm trying to think, it hadn't had a terrestrial repeat, and it's just before my time, so in terms of watching the series, so yes, it must have been when it came out on VHS eventually. So I probably didn't see it till the early 90s. There's a thought.
Richard just implied it was an earlier release than the VHS.
Yeah, I didn't have a VHS recorder until about 1990. So
okay, this is quite a bombshell. How have we not known this before? What sort of Doctor Who fan are you?
Oh, quite, yeah. My
It's not a
parents
trick
didn't
question.
believe
You
in
didn't have
them.
a VHS player that wasn't.
No,
they didn't believe in.
no.
Well, you know, all the things not to believe in. It's up there.
Gav?
Yes, my dad would have had the VHS, and it's one of a handful that I don't think I remember ever seeing for the first time. It's just one of those things that I've always remembered. So it's really hard to get a fresh new take on it because it's just so familiar. Like you said.
I was just thinking, it suddenly occurs to me that I probably actually first saw this in a convention screening room.
Ah, yes.
It's the most likely option.
I had to get the DVD down off the shelf, or rather out of the cardboard box, because my BritBox subscription unexpectedly lapsed. You didn't need to know that. And I noticed on the DVD packaging, it said that it had been voted the story fans most wanted to see, which I guess is why it was released relatively early in the range. And I wonder, I mean, was it also released early in the VHS range because it was known to be a favourite? And as such, it's held up as a fan fave for several decades. It hasn't risen and fallen as much as some other stories.
Was it on that list or one of the polls that went round fandom asking which fans wanted released?
Which time, video or DVD?
Video, sorry.
Because that was... Didn't they ask everyone at Longleat? And everyone, they all said...
Revenge of the Cybermen.
No, they said something of the Cybermen, and Revenge was the only one they had, I think.
Ah.
something went wrong. There was a... It wasn't as simple as fans assuming Revenge must have been great. And then been disappointed.
Well,
I think
we remembered.
they wanted Cybermen, and they wanted Tom Baker. So the people at the
Limited options
the BBC thought, well, obviously this has got to be the best story ever. and
they were right.
Yeah.
How's that working out for you, as the children say?
Yeah. So, from my memory of being in sort of organised fandom in the early to mid 80s, I would say that Pyramids was always kind of held up as being a good story, and that's probably helped by the Terrance Dicks novelisation, which I mean I don't remember it particularly, but it was one of the earlier ones, so it's generally one of the ones he'd have put a lot into. Yeah, it's interesting that for you, Paul and Giles, it's almost like a missing episode that you were sort of repatriated with eventually, right? It's like my experience of the Troughtons of having read the books and then maybe sort of eventually coming across them, or maybe the odd episode or two of them later on. It's sort of weird that we have that relationship with the show in the UK, that if we weren't actually around when it was shown, it's a bit haphazard when it turned up eventually. So who wants to kick us off, in terms of thoughts on this particular viewing?
Oh, all right then. I can follow my own train of thought to conclusion. As I was saying, the fan, it's not gone down in fan estimation over time, and it hasn't gone down in mine. It's terrific, isn't it? I think it's kind of like, not the pinnacle of the Hinchcliffe era for me, but almost like the uber Hinchcliffe story, the archetypal, both the archetype and the summit, the zenith, if you will. Obviously, Talons is my favourite, but Talons is not typical. Every time I go back and watch any Hinchcliffe, I realise how atypical Talons is. Robert Holmes going completely mad and being let off the leash right at the end. But this is the bread and butter of the Hinchcliffe era, isn't it? What strikes me, though, makes me ask questions about Holmes himself. For me, there are two different Holmes stories. There are his own, which were mostly written before and after his time as script editor, although Deadly Assassin and Talons creep into that category. And then there are the ones he rewrote while he was a script editor. And they are very different. The ones he rewrote as script editor, they tend to be the ones that the fans loved most because they're the ones that are most straightly gothic horror. But they tend to be lacking a lot of things we think of as Holmesy tropes elsewhere. They don't have anywhere near as much humour. They don't have the Holmesian double acts. I'm not saying that you can't tell it's him, because of course you can. But it's him in a different mode somehow. It's not lesser him. He's pushing the gothic horror that his producer wanted and doing it as well as anybody else ever did. No, well, better than anybody else ever did. But I wonder if he was feeling constrained. I wonder if he was keen to put a funny... Could he put a funny poacher in, or another funny brother of Scarman, or does he? Or does anyone know what I mean?
Definitely.
It's a rhetorical question. There may be no answer to it, but
I wonder if there's a bit of confirmation bias in what we think of as a Holmes characteristic, and therefore we highlight the examples of it, like the double act. But from my understanding, this is as Holmesian crafted as they come in terms of him seeing his idea through to conclusion. Because he conceived the idea, or jointly conceived ideas with Louis Griefer, and set the task of Louis Griefer to write him an Egypt-themed gothic. He said he wanted horrors roaming through studio fog, and just had that atmosphere. And Louis Griefer went away and did his thing and came back. And although it wasn't the sole reason, because there were, he was ill and then he went abroad, it wasn't what Holmes wanted or felt.
There were no monks, no werewolf, and no...
Exactly. And so Holmes threw out all of it, including his characters, and started again. So my understanding is it is essentially Holmes doing precisely what he wanted and taking it back over when someone didn't fulfill his requirements. That's not to say that Philip Hinchcliffe wasn't steering things, obviously, but I don't get the sense that Holmes was constrained. I think that when it wasn't turning into what he wanted, he made sure it was. So I think he did precisely what he was intent on doing from the beginning.
I don't want to get too sidetracked, though, but what I was getting at more was that I feel like Holmes had one sort of style in his early days in the programme. Through the Pertwee era, his stories stand out by nature of being quite satirical. Also, various flavours of humour, satire, and broader character stuff. And and you could argue he returned to that in some ways after he was script editor, but during the time he was script editor, particularly when most of the stories that didn't have his name on, but which we know he wrote almost the entire thing, tend to be rather straighter. You may not agree with that, but if you do agree with that, because I feel that's the case, that I was wondering whether it was because he was rewriting somebody else's work that he did it in a different style, or was it just because...
I think it's tonally quite similar to Spearhead from Space. It's quite a long way from, say, Carnival of Monsters.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wouldn't say it's completely atypical, but there's no attempt at comedy whatsoever, and even Tom Baker is playing it absolutely deadly earnest.
Yeah. I think what I'm talking about is that stories like it's got more in common with Ark in Space.
Yes.
I wonder whether it's just because, to some extent, he was having to turn it out under pressure, and they were very much doing that boilerplate thing of what Hammer horror movie are we going to rip off this week? Yeah, to my mind, it had more. I was relieved to find there were more witty lines in it than I immediately remembered, because I went into this actually with somewhat of a heavy heart, because it's not one I watched with great pleasure. I can think of many more stories, and I think I skew more towards like the stuff when we've had a related discussion about the stuff when Leela comes in. That's, I just feel that's Professor Higgins' Eliza Doolittle relationship works. And it's not. I feel bad about saying that, but it feels like it's slightly heavy going, that it's all taking itself so seriously, and I quite like the. I was quite glad for the wittier moments that did crop up in it, and
interesting,
and little things like the Marx Brothers gag in episode 4 that you just think, oh yeah, there's some Doctor Who that I like. Just a silly.
That's really interesting, because I think of this as a funny story. I mean, it's deadly earnest, but I think all of the best Doctor Who take the serious stuff really seriously, and the levity is played straight. And I mean, there's loads of fun, and to be fair, that's not a lot of it is not from the script. There's a great deal of improvisation.
Yeah.
And I think the chances are that if you name a funny moment, like the priest hole and all the bits, that it's improvisation, or worked out in rehearsals, I should say.
Yes, yeah.
But it's interesting.
Well, Liz Sladen's trying very hard, isn't she? I mean, or at least, she's, a lot of the stuff that she does is sort of bringing levity whilst Tom Baker's doing his deadly earnest stuff.
But I think they would. I think they would have worked it out together.
Though. Yeah.
So she's not thinking, Tom, I need to lighten this up a bit. Tom's gone into a strange place. I would come down right in the middle there. How very interesting to hear. I wouldn't. I thought we were going to be agreed on this, like the rest of fandom has been throughout time. It's and it sounds like we all are, in the sense that we all think it's really good, but we're not quite sure why. We're going to end up splitting into factions on just whether. For me, it's the right sort of balance. It's, as you say, the funny bits are mainly witty dialogue and character based. But one reason I like it is because it is so. It's not that it's straight, but it takes a serious situation and treats it very seriously. For example, if a bog standard Doctor Who story might say, "This is the greatest threat we've ever faced. This is going to destroy. This could destroy the universe. This is awful," and you wouldn't feel it. Whereas here, without having seen hordes of millions of Daleks approach on the horizon, just with a very small contained story with a small cast, you absolutely believe it when Doctor Who tells us that he'll eat this planet and then move on and do the rest of the universe one planet at a time. And thus it deserves for the Doctor to treat it with this unusual amount of gravitas, and for him to have to go to unusual lengths to impress upon the seriousness of the situation on Sarah Jane. And it breaks through into every area of the story, even despite the fact that it's supposed to be an old-fashioned Hammer horror-style story. It's very good as science fiction as well. It has a few good sciencey moments. For the first time after 13 years, somebody decides they need to explain why they can't just bugger off.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I don't know what prompted Robert H. to suddenly feel like this needed addressing. Perhaps it occurred to him in the middle of the story in a way that it never had before. I mean, I suppose, is it because they have to use the TARDIS during the story, and most of the time they don't?
It was because there was a threat to history, and he felt that the rhetoric was always exactly what Sarah said, was that we know the Earth wasn't destroyed now because we're from the future. Which
I guess is why one reason we didn't like writing historical ones.
Just thinking.
Well, that and the research.
Thinking about pseudo historicals, as we'd now call them, and just trying to think. I mean, if you go back, okay, there's the Time Meddler and stuff like that, but I mean the time. I'm just trying to think how many there have really been where they've gone there under their own steam. Because the Time Warrior is slightly different, because there you've got Lynx scooping people up.
It is slightly addressed in The Time Warrior, Holmes again, but slightly more quietly. The Doctor just has the comment that if you give them these weapons now, they'll have much more advanced weapons by the, whatever he says, 16th century. I can't remember what he says.
But it's, apart from that, we've all forgotten that line's in there. It's certainly, if it's in dialogue, the average viewer is going to be in one ear and out the other. So here we get to see it.
Yeah.
And whether or not they understand it, they certainly feel it, don't they? But it's very economically written, that scene. I should have written down the dialogue, then I could have proved how economically written it is. But like all the big moments, the science fiction dilemmas, the moral dilemmas, everything is, yes, written with great precision and economy and force in a way in which some other stories don't achieve, including the one we're moving on to.
There was a line in episode 2 that I liked, where I think Sarah says, "Egyptian mummies building a rocket, that's crazy." It does feel at times that there are crazy things going on, but as we've all said at different times, because it's done in a very, everybody in the story believes in the story, so it carries us along with it, I think.
I always find it fascinating. I like the archaeology, no pun intended, of sifting through the early versions and seeing the echoes of what came before. And Pyramids of Mars fundamentally doesn't make any sense. But I'll forgive all its flaws because it's brilliant and I love it.
Here we go.
It doesn't, though. It makes no sense. A pyramid on Mars imprisoning Sutekh is just nonsense. And then Sutekh, 100 million miles, he can telekinetically or telepathically speak to Mars, but he can't somehow leave his prison in Egypt, even though he's beaming his brain into the TARDIS and he's beaming his brain onto Mars, and whatever he wants. He can levitate the TARDIS key from 2,000 miles away, but he can't leave. Anyway,
that's a very good point. But remember where you were. That's a very good point, but it's not what I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to say, if he can beam his mind across that distance, how come something as silly as the speed of light is used as the science fiction explanation for how the Doctor can win at the end? That must mean his brain is moving faster than light.
Yeah.
Which rather undercuts the point I was going to make about what a nice little sciencey moment that was and how Newton would be really pleased with it. Yeah. But anyway, sorry, as you were.
No, all I was going to say was it's interesting then discovering the reason that this nonsensical story has been reassembled out of these jigsaw puzzle pieces by Robert Holmes, because the original story was that there was a space rocket being built by this space agency. I can't think of the name of it. It's called the Beta Wave or something like that. And they were sending a rocket to Mars. Originally, there was a whole plot about grain growing in the deserts of Egypt. They were going to use to terraform the deserts of Mars. That was the logical link between Egypt and Mars. So they were building a rocket that was part of a space program. Then Sutekh was going to hijack the rocket and fire it into a pyramid that was on Mars, where his old mate Horus was in suspended animation. He just wanted to kill him as an act of revenge. A logical framework exists from a story that got swept away, but I like the fact that you can see the shadows of the original storyline just been repurposed into a thing that
I feel a bit sorry for
makes no sense.
Lewis Griffer there, because it sounds like he's put rather too much thought into it. It really tried to think, because when you're presented with these shopping list stories, it's not technically a shopping list. 2 or 3 elements doesn't make a shopping list, but Egypt and Mars is enough to be hang on a minute, what? It actually given it some proper thought.
It was actually Egypt
it's not what Doctor Who needs. It needs to be much simpler than that. And poor bloke.
It was actually
Robert
Egypt and the Moon originally, and then they switched it to Egypt and Mars.
Changed.
But it reminds me of, it's slightly tangential, but it reminds me of that Russell T Davies assessing the Web of Fear, and he said the Yeti and web guns, the Yeti and web, it doesn't go together. So under my stewardship, he said we'd have scotched that because there's no logic to it. But he's aware that it's brilliant and it works. And that's the thing with Pyramids of Mars. There's all the logic.
He'd have had giant spiders in the underground, because then you could
have webs,
spraying webs.
Yeah.
Yes.
So sometimes the connective tissue falls away, and
This is why Doctor Who is brilliant, and why sometimes it isn't brilliant. Because it is all about these bizarre juxtapositions, isn't it? That no other programme would ever be in a position to be trying to juxtapose these things. it's not just a time travel thing. It's somehow become intrinsic to the format of the program. It's not necessarily taking two things from different times and putting them together. It's different genres clashing. I don't know. It just seems to become accepted that Doctor Who is all about things that don't belong together being smushed together.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, yes, I'll be coming onto this a related point later about it's making these unrelated things fit. That can make, for me, a story can stand or fall. A story might be superficially quite interesting and diverting, but if it hasn't got the solid foundations then it never works for me. And that's why sometimes these stories that are less than the sum of their parts fail on some level which you can't quite put your finger on, but you just feel these things don't go together somehow. Anyway,
so it's very odd, this prehistory of this early story, the pre-existing story, because it almost sounds a bit like the Vampire from Space, kind of that thing, the predecessor of Claws of Axos, kind of this whole thing with grain on, like, and it was a near future set, so presumably it was it actually going to be a unit story, or at least the Brigadier was going to be
near
right
future. Yeah,
tangentially
space agency. The grain came later. I'm struggling to remember what the first iteration was.
I know there was a sarcophagus in the British Museum at one point.
Yeah, so I think the sarcophagus originally had a mummy in it, and then later, in the later version, the sarcophagus they hoped had the seeds of this ancient grain in that was going to solve all their problems, and then when they opened it, it let out this ancient evil, I think.
Right.
I'm a bit hazy on it.
One thing I picked up on was that they said, there was an Egyptian mania in the early 70s to some extent because the Tutankhamun, the Tut exhibition had been at the British Museum in 72, which, Richard, did you go? Do you remember?
No. Too far north.
Too far north. Apparently I went, but I would have been a babe in arms at the time, or a toddler in arms, so I was taken, but I remember nothing. But so apparently they cottoned on to the fact that, well, hang on, Egypt doesn't allow the export of antiquities these days, so they then thought, oh well, what if it was brought back by a Victorian or Edwardian archaeologist and has lain unopen, and then that was the springboard for the whole Marcus Scarman thing when Bob Holmes came to redo it in his style. But it's an odd, the origin of it. And the other thing that does come up is the ancient astronauts aspect of it, and I was quite interested. I picked up on something to do with, there was what was this guy's name? Henri Lotte, who was a French archaeologist and explorer who found these frescoes in Algeria in 1958. So this is quite well pre-Von Daniken, because Von Daniken didn't really start doing his stuff until the late 60s and giving Switzerland a bad name. And but he found these wacky frescoes in a place called Tassili in the Algerian desert, and they include what appears to be a sort of space-suited creature with a somewhat
brow,
cyclopean head. Monobrow, which sounds a bit like it might have been. I think in the production notes they suggest it was the inspiration for the mummy design, but it reminds me a bit more of the spacesuit when Scarman first appears. It looks quite, and he studied calling this the Great Martian God. So that may be the first real connection between sort of Mars and ancient Egypt that was kind of hanging around in the prehistory, so far as I can figure out.
Okay.
What year was it Viking that took the photos of the Mars face and the Mars pyramid?
76, I think.
But that's afterwards, so...
Yeah. Because I briefly wondered whether that's where it had come from, and then I realised I didn't think the dates lined up. That the Doctor Who predated it. I can tell you lots of other things that aren't relevant or true as well.
Well, it's one of those funny things that that whole Cydonia region was, suddenly came to prominence after.
It launched in August the 20th, 1975, and this is shown in October. So, I mean, it might have been a thing that was in people's consciousness.
Mars probably was, that's true. but it didn't get there until it would have been at
No,
least
until the following year.
yeah, spring of '76. Because didn't one of them touch down on Independence Day, if I remember rightly? I think one of the landers, and most of the orbiter photos didn't come back until after that. So they were orbiting for a few years. So.
Tell me if I'm being premature, but are we able to move on? Have we covered Mars and Egyptology?
Yeah,
Have we
fine.
move on to mummies?
Yeah, go on.
No, well, obviously, you see, I was hoping to rewatch some of the classic mummy films for tonight so that I could actually make a positive, tangible contribution, but I didn't. So can somebody tell me where they think the mummy stuff in this comes from? Does it, for all the allusions to Hammer, or indeed Universal monsters, what does it owe to the Mummy, or indeed the Mummy? Or the Mummy, but that was made 20 years later, so probably not that one.
It seems to me, and I'm not coming from a position of great knowledge here, but that those great big lumbering robots don't, to me, sort of seem to tie in particularly to mummies or any of that. They're more kind of just horrific figures. I mean, the bandages, obviously, but other than that, they seem to be the wrong physical shape.
Do you mean visually, or
visually?
Or how
Yeah.
they serve?
Well, visually,
the plot?
but also, I suppose, they don't necessarily. Yeah, I mean, they're not a kind of ancient threat in themselves, are they? They're just sort of dumb servants. Yeah.
I'm thinking that because the plot doesn't treat them like Hammer mummies, apart from the very first scene where the one time we see it coming out of a sarcophagus.
Yeah.
Apart from that,
Yeah.
they might as well not be mummies. And I think that's probably why the costume designers didn't feel the need to make them look like the classic mummy, which we get in the Orient Express story. They go all out. They probably thought, well, we might as well lean more into make 50-50 robots and mummies rather than... Because there's never really any attempt by the story to make you believe... For example, that could have been a completely different story and another valid way of doing it. And to be honest, if the debt to Hammer horror was as strong as fans unthinkingly assume it is, in not just this story but the whole of Hinchcliffe era, then there would be some sort of question mark over whether these were undead bodies. But there never is. They always look like robots. The script doesn't, as I say, raise that question, so the visual design doesn't bother either. And it becomes something completely superficial, and barely even superficial.
It's funny as well, because it's not part of the Ancient Aliens storyline. It doesn't quite mesh. There's no suggestion that we get our mummy mythology because Sutekh has robots that look like mummies. There's no through line to that logic.
No.
Robert Holmes originally suggested that Lewis Griefer's story had mummies that were robots, but then Griefer wrote it that they were creatures, they were living things. I think the Eye of Horus was a weapon that turned people into mummies in a sort of immortalization as the dead kind of process, and that the mummies would break out and feed on people. So there is a version that would have had mummies stalking and eating people and being living things. But then Robert Holmes flipped it back and said, I told you I wanted robots. So we got robots. And yeah, there's no reason to it.
Apart from being mummies, they do work well. I mean, we were laughing when we looked at Mordred Undead at the sort of way that they were trying to make those creatures glide, and there was no real sense. With this, the camera work and the way the mummies sort of lumber, again, it doesn't really bear much examination to mummies in other genres, but it is very threatening. They're well realised.
But still not that much like mummies. I mean, most Doctor Who monsters in most Doctor Who stories move like Hammer horror mummies. They lumber with their arms outstretched, even when they don't need to. We finally get a story where they would be justified in moving like mummies, and they don't.
No. So
funny.
They should be ridiculous, but somehow they're terrifying. Was my thought.
Bob Holmes clearly knew what he was doing, but he's simplifying it. He's simplifying it, and he's taken a story with a really well thought out, logical, watertight premise. You might not like it. It might be a very good one, but it was, I think, those things, based on what you've said. It's all new to me. And he's kind of removed a lot of the logic. He's removed almost everything he didn't need, and just kept the things that serve the atmosphere that he wants to create, the tone of the story. And I feel like that's what he I felt that's what he always does as script editor, and also when he's building a story up from scratch.
I often cite Pyramids of Mars as it's when I get into discussions with people about films that one of us likes and the other one dislikes, and the person who dislikes will inevitably resort to explaining all of the logical and technical reasons why the film or TV series or whatever it is objectively flawed. And I'm always reminded of Pyramids of Mars as that example for me, where I absolutely love it. And it is flawed in umpteen different ways from a narrative, technical perspective. But I don't care and it doesn't matter. And people telling me that these things don't make any sense, it exemplifies the fact that we like what we like. And the logic behind it is either accepted or discarded or overlooked, depending on our feelings, and that our feelings come ahead of the logic some of the time, or a lot of the time.
Sure. Giles, you were trying to say something.
I was just going to get back to the thing of the relations to the Hammer movie and so on, and the thing is that, to my mind, what he's done is he's actually made Marcus Scarman. To my mind, he takes on a lot of the roles of the Mummy, and a lot of the characteristics of the Mummy as played by like Christopher Lee. I mean, obviously Christopher Lee was bandaged up and so on, but in terms of some of the things but some of the specifics, like the shooting moment, which I know is quoted as being a direct lift of when he gets shot, I think is pretty much a direct lift from or copy of a moment that happens in the Hammer movie, although it's then again, well, it was on the poster, put it that way, I think. Bullets going through his body and he keeps on walking, kind of thing. So I think some of that stuff got transferred, because he's got the sort of undead pallor and everything. Yeah. And I think then the robot mummies are there just kind of for the iconography of it.
What a terrific observation. I think you've cracked it. At various times my mind was wandering off to Talons and making a comparison between the two. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's just if it genuinely was reminding me of it, or if it's just because I'm obsessed with Talons and I'd rather be talking about that. Like an unprepared child in a GCSE exam. To answer the question, why is Pyramids of Mars, I must first talk about... I mean, right from the first episode, the way everyone reacts to the Egyptian.
Yeah.
Even though to just sort of referring to him by his nationality rather than as if he was a person, and his characterization as a primitive who worships this figure who's just from a more advanced civilization as a god. That's all there, isn't it? Yeah, there was more. But right down to maybe at the other end of the story with Sutekh's dialogue, where he talks the same sort of ripe, pulpy villain stuff that Bob Holmes specialises in, and which say Magnus Greel comes out with. But it's just kept the right side of melodrama, and the dialogue is just slightly less melodramatic, which means that Gabriel Wolfe is able to give a less melodramatic performance. And that same grandiose language, miserable worms and crush and insects and things, suddenly seems very threatening rather than something you would be happy to laugh at.
Yeah, so, it's a stunning performance.
As I say, obviously Robert Holmes, but in a different mode. And yes, Gabriel.
Yeah. I mean, the elephant in the room is that Part 4 isn't quite as good as the other three, I think. And I do think that Sutekh is more menacing when it's just the voice. I mean, when you see a bit too much of him at the start of episode 4, I don't think he's quite as effective.
You think? I was thinking, what I thought was, I wasn't looking forward to episode 4 because I thought this is 25 minutes of puzzle solving.
Right.
It's just Death to the Daleks all over again. And yet, I was quite pleased it starts with what felt like 5 or 10 minutes of Doctor Who and Sutekh.
Yeah.
Which is one of the best bits.
Yes.
To see the Doctor's reduced so abjectly, and I don't think Sutekh loses anything. I mean, to be honest, we haven't really had much of a feel for him until that point, and I don't think he loses anything.
And I'd slightly forgot the fact that he does, he does actually take over the Doctor. It's only the distraction when he thinks the Doctor's already.
Yeah, and he just does just like that. The Doctor doesn't even have time to fight. It's all.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're wrong there. You're wrong, and you're a grotesquely ugly freak. Sorry, that's a quote. Gav knows where I got that
from. I do.
From.
It's brass eye. Oh no, it's today. I don't know. I thought it was really interesting. Episode 4, the traditional format is that it accelerates towards a physical confrontation. I mean, yes, okay, we do end up with two mummies punching each other in a big explosion. But in terms of the broad structure of the episode, comparing again to Talons, there's the big laser battle and the escape and all that going on. And so instead of building towards a physical confrontation or a series of physical set pieces, it's an intellectual series, and that all of the physical stuff is in the Earth environment. It's all sort of very visceral, earthly pursuits, poaching and explosions and things, and then you get to the alien world, and it's a really interesting switch, the kind of thing that they have done in other stories, usually in a six-parter, to give you something fresh, either at the beginning or the tail end, and the story takes an interesting turn. Yeah, I just think it freshens it up, because I don't know what you'd have done with another episode of Running Around the Priory. I think it'd have been lesser for it.
I think you're right that it is needed, and it is a clever idea to make it more of a mental battle, but it could have been better, and perhaps it was just pressure of time. Because what would have been better is some kind of tangible battle of wills or intellects between the two. But of course, how do you ever show that in Doctor Who? Nobody's ever shown that other than by Doctor Who. And the other way of doing this is the end of Brain and Morbius, where they both grab hold of either end of a some sort of high-tech seesaw, and it depends.
Yeah, there's never any effective.
And so really,
battle.
it feels to me like he knew what he wanted tonally, but we do end up with these silly, just basically riddles. If we could have come up with some stronger analogy for that.
Well, just to flip back again to the Lewis Griefer version, they were making their way through the labyrinth of the pyramid,
right,
avoiding traps and things like that. So it was.
That might have been more interesting.
Like literally Death of the Daleks then, which was a pyramid.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. You've got Death of the Daleks, and you've also got, I suppose, 5 Doctors later on. I mean, I don't think any of them works especially brilliantly. Well,
they don't work because it's a very linear process. I mean, unless the most you can do is carefully arrange the puzzles so they get a bit harder.
Yeah.
But it's not. What sort of puzzles are they? Are they real puzzles so the audience are in with a chance of solving it, which makes it more like an Agatha Christie? It never really works as drama. It works as children's TV. So no, I think this is probably... haven't watched Death to the Daleks recently. I feel like this works much better than that.
Yeah.
That is a bit more like a series of fairground attractions, isn't it, than this? Or a fun house. I don't know. Is it? I can't remember.
I think it's about the same, to be honest. But
At least there's no checkerboard floor here.
No, it's not quite so well realised. The lumbering things that sort of appear aren't all that brilliant in Death to the Daleks.
No.
Well,
there's no very clever puzzles that rely on an intimate knowledge of how pi doesn't work.
But you've got the old riddle of
oh yes,
one person lying. That's a fun intellectual thing. I mean, the viewer doesn't get any time whatsoever to solve it, because the Doctor just says, "Well, I've heard this one before," and moves on.
It's funny because what you were saying about the navigating the pyramid, it is rather strange that did I blink and miss it? We don't get any establishing shot of this pyramid on Mars.
No.
Which is really, it seems like an omission to me. That if I was going to make a criticism of, it feels like one doesn't, the locales get mixed up. The fact that you don't really get unless you're paying attention, you lose track of the fact, well, hang on, Sutekh's in Egypt.
Yeah.
They're in England, and we don't really get any further connection to that. And then we don't see we don't see the fact there's this pyramid on Mars.
Yeah, there's only one pyramid in it.
Yes.
Stargrove.
But it feels like, well, hang on,
there should be 2 pyramids which have a sort of identical visual style.
Possibly,
one of them in Egypt, one of them in Mars. Hammer home the fact that the Osirians had this effect on human evolution.
It just feels like,
along with everybody else,
the occasional establishing shot would not go amiss to remind you of who is where, and perhaps particularly once they're on Mars, if you did see a pyramid standing in the midst of this wasteland of Martian landscape, then you might get more of an impression that they are making their way through this
Yeah, sort of Seeds of Death style, maybe, or something. With the Earth and the Moon.
I probably shouldn't admit this because it does say more about me than the story. But it took me quite a few viewings as a young fan for it really to hammer home the fact that Sutekh is in Egypt, not on Mars. No matter how many times I watched it or read, I would always remember it as him being in the pyramid on Mars, because that's obviously where he is at the end of the story. They track him down to his lair. I don't know how I must be a bit thick, but I think it's part not helped by that. Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised if the general public, who obviously don't have... I have the advantage of a thorough grounding in Doctor Who type things, which is only undercut by my natural inclination to pay attention. Can I return to the tone? Some time back I was expressing my thought. This is one of the most serious-minded stories, apart from occasional bits of business on the part of the lead actors. But what I remember is that the Doctor is very stern in this, and very alien. Yeah. And indeed, to presage where we're going with the next story, he's at his most alien in inverted commas, and at his most 12th Doctorish, which is snappy, not really seemingly not understanding or respecting human emotions. And luckily he's not like that all the way through. There are moments of that, and again they're very economically written, not overplayed. Again, without giving too much away, that is not what I feel about the second story we're discussing today.
I think you've given a fair amount away.
Well, I mean, you've given us our first link anyway between the two stories.
But it's written nicely and played very nicely between those two, so you never feel... It is only just moments, isn't it? They set it up in the first episode where Doctor Who's... I love that establishing shot. What does the camera do? Does it zoom up on him or something, where he's just standing looking like he walks in eternity while standing stock still in the middle of the...
He's got his head bowed, hasn't he?
Yes.
And he lifts his head.
Soon be middle-aged. Yes.
It always feels like that scene follows on from something else.
Right.
And
Well, it seems to be presaging. It's there to presage the mood of this story, except it's written as though he's just pissed off that he has to... He feels like he's one of the Brigadier's companions rather than vice versa.
It's odd that this goes from that they have Planet of Evil in the middle, because it works far better as a...
Was that a late switch?
I don't know. Good question.
That's why I forget that it does go in there.
But yeah, it was far better as a takeoff from Terror of the Zygons, as being arguably the last hurrah really of the unit gang as a whole. And although they probably didn't know it at the time.
No, but it's written as if they know, and they're trying to soften the blow to prepare us for the fact that we may not be seeing so much of the Brigadier unit anymore.
Well, so you've also got this bizarre thing about, well, because we're going back to see the Brigadier and unit, then we have to say, well, we've travelled in time but not in space, so we're on the same plot as Unit HQ, but it's a different building, so now you've got to say, well, it burnt down. But then your problem is, does that mean, well, Unit HQ can't be any older than 1912 when they would have rebuilt it, but then it doesn't really coincide with any of the buildings that we've seen being Unit HQ.
That's great. Yes. How many have we... Was there any... this could be a podcast in itself. Maybe Gav could tell us. And in fact, I'm going to say one more thing before he does. They tie themselves in knots here because we're in a building that looks very old, but because the plot requires it not to be old, they have to say that it's not a real priest hole. It's some sort of Victorian folly priest hole. That is right, isn't it?
Yes.
And
Gothic folly, yeah.
So it's all terribly confused. And then it's replaced by another building that actually looks older than it would be if it replaced this one. No matter which of the Unit HQs we're talking about. How many times does Unit HQ look like a second division, a Grade 2 star listed country mansion? And
5
how many
Doctors.
times does it look like
To be honest.
well,
is the
yes,
3 Doctors and the 5 Doctors the same building? I meant to check.
Don't think so.
Because the 3 Doctors disappearing into the black hole is always the Unit HQ that I picture in my mind. It's similar enough in the 5 Doctors to believe it, and it's similar enough to Stargrove to believe it. But you could leave I mean, Stargrove's left burning the Priory.
I don't know why they didn't just say it was burnt out and
could be a
partly rebuilt rather than being completely...
Well, especially when the Doctor has that line about, this room, for instance, could be converted into a lab.
that's
it would be handy
that's
for
improvised.
Yes,
Tom Baker.
Oh, is it? Okay, right. But the building's not that old. It's a Victorian Gothic fantasy. Apparently the original did burn down, and this is the 1848 rebuild.
I see.
In sort of French chateau style, kind of with a bit of Gothic.
And this is Stargroves, which I was really hoping I had been to, because I could have had another instalment in my series of Paul visits. But I hadn't. I'd been to the one from Seeds of Doom, which obviously is not the same one, because even in Doctor Who they wouldn't repeat the same location twice in a series.
That's Athelhampton, isn't it?
It
Athelhampton House, yes. Which
I'll save that glorious anecdote when we get to Seeds of Doom.
No, I don't think it's ever been open to the public particularly.
I'm going to say something now that's blindingly obvious, but I do love Bernard Archer doing his
Bernard Archer
playing Marcus Scarman, and it's interesting because in my head, for some reason, I see him as a sympathetic figure. I mean, he's painted slightly sympathetic, but actually, when you looking at this time, when you see him at the start, he isn't all that sympathetic there either. I mean, basically, he's kind of bossing around the natives, and he's greedy for knowledge and riches or whatever. He's not super sympathetic. And to be honest, the sympathy comes more from Lawrence and that relationship, and I suppose Warlock as well, who's a sympathetic character. They seem to like him, so there must be something good in him, I suppose, if both of them like him.
Well, he's English. Isn't that enough? And rich. He's yes, you're right. Putting that together with Giles' amazing observation that he's the soulful part of the mummy myth.
Yeah,
it's been split in twain between the visual side and the heart of that story. This is a story where everybody dies, is it not?
Pretty much.
That's part of a small sub-genre of Doctor Who. It's not the first, is it? Have we had any this grim before?
Thingamajig, the
Massacre, arguably.
Mission to the Unknown,
yeah.
which sort of doesn't count in that it's... Well, no, it does count, I suppose, because even if the Doctor had been in it, every guest character would have died.
The delegates don't die.
Oh, no, you're an idiot, Richard.
Yeah, but the mummies don't die. Oh, wait a minute, they do. I don't know.
The robots...
Sutekh doesn't. Oh, he dies. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, everybody dies. Golly.
Just this once.
Everybody dies, yeah.
Well, that's join that club to which horror of Fang Rock will later, slightly more ostentatiously, be admitted.
The poacher was supposed to live. He lived in Robert Holmes's version, but Paddy Russell thought he was a bit of a loose end, so she finished him off.
So was he meant to just escape? Because presumably he didn't carry on into the later episodes in any way.
No, he just sort of tailed off.
That is a loose end. Well, that's not like Holmes at all.
He was just left somewhere within the deflection barrier and didn't just got left behind.
Played by Roberta Tovey's father.
Tovey's dad, of course.
Yeah. Snap.
Was he also called One Take Tovey?
One death Tovey.
It runs in the family.
One shot.
Well, what an interesting connection. This and Horror Fang Rock, both stories where everyone dies, both directed by Paddy Russell, both stories where the Doctor is rather morose, and that's partly in the writing and partly because Tom Baker didn't like being directed by a woman and decided to act up. Is that right? Stop me if I've gone down the wrong.
Well, I think he certainly didn't get on with her in the second one. I don't know how badly they fell out in this one.
He didn't want to go into the mummy.
He's not ostentatiously walking through doors. Oh yes, that's right. He
didn't want to go into the mummy suit. We know that, and she insisted.
Okay.
She said you're wearing that thing because people will know. And yeah, they did.
You walk in a rather eccentric fashion.
It's interesting. Liz Sladen was. I mean, she wasn't overtly negative about Paddy Russell, but you get the sense that there was friction, and Liz Sladen criticised the fact that Paddy Russell did so much in rehearsal. Liz Sladen said she over-rehearsed everything, and that resulted in the actors getting bored of their material and injecting stuff and livening it up. And I found that
a
really
bad thing?
curious. Well, that's what I
Yes.
thought. Because Liz Sladen ended up pointing to certain bits of business, such as like in the TARDIS where she's playing with the shawl over her head.
Yeah.
Lovely bit.
Exactly. It's wonderful. And Liz Sladen was
I
saying...
hated that sort of stuff. I wish I hadn't had to do that.
Basically,
I had to
she
do
was
it
saying...
because I thought of it in a boring rehearsal.
Basically, she's saying we were so bored of doing the same stuff over and over again, we'd find interesting things to do. And I just thought, how weird to turn that into a
That's
negative.
one of those.
That's
Well,
acting,
she didn't really
isn't
mean
it?
that. That's one of those strange anecdotes where somebody's put together two things they felt that aren't actually connected. A bit like a writer being told Mars and Egypt. And she's trying to make one consistent anecdote out of it.
It's like those, the stories you get from actors about how they really loved a particular story. Well, I mean, they enjoyed the social experience of working on it. It didn't actually necessarily mean it was a brilliant story. And equally, the other way around, you may have hated doing it, but actually
Can't
the
trust
performance
actors.
that you put in was great. So we enjoyed watching it. Sorry you had a bad time while it was being made, but it's not going to make us dislike the story.
You tell them.
They won't listen to me.
Well, how many sarcophagi out of 5?
5.
I mean, the problem is that growing up with it, it's impossible to be dispassionate about it because, the Doctor Who that you grow up with is kind of, what you expect it to be. It's the quintessential Doctor Who. So when Giles was saying that, Leela was more his thing, well, for me, 1975 is a really kind of seminal year for my viewing. At some point in 1975, I started to read the David Whittaker Target book, and probably by the end of 75, I've read a dozen of them. And the two series were so close together that they only occupy about 15 months. So across this period, it's a concentrated chunk of Doctor Who coming into my head at the age of 7 and then 8. So it just is how I expected Doctor Who to be from there on in, I suppose. But I still think it's a very good one.
It is.
Robert Holmes is very good. That's my hot take. I wrote down he has a penchant for a sort of lyrical quality to certain lines of dialogue, just odd bits and bobs like this is the rhythm of the Osirans, and just quirks that are slightly atypical. And I wrote down one of his script directions, which is when the Doctor has the gelignite in his hands. The Doctor carries the box with tender solicitude. And he's wonderful. And it's totally unnecessary to be that good in stuff no one is ever going to read, except me, 50 years later.
Just, I hate to drag things back, but with regard to the killing off thing, it feels like there's I don't know, in this it feels very... It's just being very, very efficient with characters, and in terms of it feels like it almost feels a bit perfunctory. That it just feels like, okay, your bit of the plot's done. Let's kill you off.
Well, that's the Eric Sayward approach.
It feels a bit.
But it's always
in this.
When Sayward does that, it's incredibly obvious that there was no.
It feels a bit that
because there's nothing else backing it up. It's never. It's only done for effect. It's like the comic. If the character's finished and he thinks he can get some shock value out of it, then they'll get rid of them. But it never really feels like it's done at the right dramatic point, or with any higher purpose in mind.
This feels, in contrast to Horror of Fang Rock, for instance, this feels a bit more like that to me than something like Horror of Fang Rock, where you feel it's being. I don't know. I can't really articulate the difference.
It seems more obvious in horror because this is one of those stories where it is artificially constrained to a particular locale. It's by an invisible barrier, so they can't escape, and the small cast are trapped there. But because they can run about, have quite a lot. It's easy for your mind to lose track of how many characters there are, and they're not all in the same room together. Horror Fang Rock is more like a horror film where your eye is constantly on the diminishing small cast, but they're being picked off one by one, and you're supposed to notice that.
Because this is fundamentally a base under siege story, and it's not generally categorised as such.
Some of those deaths in horror are kind of earned, aren't they?
There's a moral to it.
I mean, I guess looking at these one, I mean, you get Namin dying at the end of episode 1. That's good as a climax. It's sort of it's sort of giving you a sense this is a deadly threat. Warlock, yeah, I mean, I suppose again, you just get the sense that anybody could die at any moment when he's sort of casually tossed aside at that point. There's pathos, I suppose, in Lawrence's death because it's the hands of his brother. The poacher does seem a bit kind of, he's just off, really, isn't he?
It does. It almost. I mean, it's the closest it gets to an Eric Sayward style. Oh, that feels cruel. Couldn't you let him get away? But this probably isn't true, as it wasn't. Turns out it wasn't Holmes. But it does feel to me, even though it's not spelled out or made explicit, which is the same thing, that it's in service of the fact of making this a story with a higher than usual level of jeopardy and consequence and threat. We have to see everybody die for us to believe. By the time that Lawrence is off screen, that's the end of the human cast, isn't it? Because Marcus is already dead, as the Doctor points out. So, yeah, I think it's deliberate, but it's not laid on with a trowel. It's sort of it creeps up on us.
When is Lawrence killed? Early in part 3, is it?
Mid.
I think.
And of course, that's when I'll come back to this, because I think, other than mummies, this is possibly the other biggest and unexpected parallel between this and Mummy on the Orient Express. The Doctor seemingly being callous in relation to the deaths of ordinary humans who are just part of because he's got his eye on the bigger picture. Which I guess is kind of what Colin Baker was always trying to say his take on the Doctor was, but it never came through in the writing he was given, unfortunately. But here, it's extremely simple. And they don't over-egg it. Sarah is momentarily annoyed with him.
Yes.
But it's written so economically, you don't seem human. And then he doesn't, he doesn't berate her for being... say, "Oh, you stupid bloody idiot, Sarah! Why can't you see it from my angle? Why do I travel with you, you ignoramus?" No, he's very kind as he can. Points out quite logically that these will be the first of millions. Well, what can you say to that? Anyway,
the music is brilliant. Was another thing I wanted to say.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of characteristic of Doctor Who music of the era, but somehow it's the best. I don't know. It feels to me like it's the best.
I think that is best when there's a chance to merge the, and there's some diegetic music. It somehow feeds into his score, and I don't mean literally. Although every time that organ starts up, I assume it's incidental music, and I remember that it's actually the other characters can hear it as well. But it does seem to inspire him when there's a very strong sense of place and
when there's a theme to latch onto, no pun intended.
Yeah, he's less good when it's set on an asteroid in another galaxy,
and he's just got to do asteroidy music, which is symbols.
Yeah, and then it just turns into Blake 7.
Yes,
any episode of Blake 7.
There's really only two other things I wanted to say about this, and they're both
only two.
They're both inconsequential, really. But I love the image of the mummy caught in the animal trap. It sort of, you're not quite sure what the noise is, but you get that sort of relentless sense of nothing's going to stop that mummy or the robot from being a menace to the poacher. And then from the sublime to the ridiculous, I suddenly thought, I know that butler, and it's Ned, the gardener Ned from the Manor Born, so I was struggling to take him seriously after that. But I mean, he's good in the role.
Just going back to that thing with the mummy in the man trap.
Yeah,
I love the fact that you can hear it for quite a few seconds as the poacher's approaching it, and it's that lovely sense that it's just sort of stuck in a loop for 30 seconds because it's come across a thing that's not part of its usual routine.
Yeah.
So it just tries to just stamp its foot over and over again for a little while, and then something else kicks in, and it thinks that it has to deal with that in a different way. It reminds me as well of the bit where the mummies fight at the end. I always liked that. I think people generally poke a bit of fun at that, but I like it from the point of view that it has that same kind of sort of robotic routine because it is
Yep.
two simple things.
They don't fight like two creatures that there's no aggression there.
No,
It's just
well, this normally works on
repetitive trying.
yeah. So it's just, well, one does it, and then the other one does it, and then the other one does it, and then the other one does it, and it's just that sense that they're just going to be stuck in that loop forever because they just haven't got any better programming, and I like that. I like robots and things. I mentioned that. I know spaceships in this though. Oh, there's a rocket. It nearly takes off. There you go. Fulfills my 2 criteria.
Yeah.
Pyramid-shaped rocket. Is it described as pyramid-shaped in the script, or is that?
Yes, it is.
Good.
So had it arrived on Mars, then it would have satisfied the title of Pyramids of Mars.
Oh, that's a point. So, assuming we take the title literally, there must be another pyramid somewhere, which has nothing to do with anything that we see in this story. So there's
Ooh.
there's scope for a
big finish, yes.
Yeah.
sideways sequel.
I think there were, because at one point the Sirens were from Mars, and then Horus had just crash landed there in his, I think, pyramid-shaped spaceship, and then in the final version, there's nobody there. It's just a random power generator parked for no reason on a nearby.
Well, maybe it's
planet.
far enough away from Sutekh. He's going to have it all on to get there. Except, of course, that he managed to construct a rocket that they could have got there with. So, yeah.
Why did he have a load of rocket components in his tomb that he then teleported to be assembled in the home counties for some reason?
It was the Siren version of IKEA, I suppose. You know, he'd ordered it before he was in prison. I don't know.
He was imprisoned with all of the components necessary to eventually aid his escape,
Yeah.
including 4 force field generating things to keep his enemies at bay while he effected his rocket building process. It's almost like this is nonsense. Garbage. This is. Who watches this rubbish?
Any other stuff that people wanted to say?
I have one random fact that I wrote down because I thought it was quite interesting. There are 4 field generators, 4 canopic jars. When fellas were buried, and women I suppose, they had 4 sets of internal organs, one in each jar, and each jar was represented by a sculpture of one of the sons of Horus. So I thought that was kind of neat that it's technically Sutekh's nephews are each of his force field generators.
Very good.
Is it? It's very generous.
The only thing I was going to add, just because I don't think we mentioned him specifically, was Michael Sheard
Yeah.
being jolly good in this, playing a bit out of a different type of character from some of his others that we've seen and enjoyed, but being very good. You make a good point that we don't, that it doesn't over-egg the pudding, and in perhaps the way that, but it almost feels like they don't make quite enough of the thing of him and Marcus. It feels like that might be a slightly bigger moment than it is, and we get some of it obviously, but it feels like he's maybe the emotional heart of that relationship is there, and maybe it should have been eked out a little bit longer.
It's obviously an interesting relationship, isn't it? Because, Marcus lives in the big house and he's been sort of stuck out by the gate. And presumably he's the younger son. I mean, perhaps in most families he'd have been kicked out altogether and had to make a living, but maybe they've come to an accommodation. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's not a relationship of equals. They don't really drill into that to any great extent. But you feel that even in the story, or maybe it's the actors, he has that. You can sort of sense that he's the appeaser in that relationship.
Yes, he's quite schoolboyish. I mean, we don't see enough of. Yeah, I guess we don't see enough of Marcus to.
If you had extra episodes, you could develop more of the characters before that. I'd like to know. We know enough about them for this story to work. But I think you could. It'll be padding. It'll be like it'll be a prologue, like the first 2 episodes of Seeds of Doom. But seeing Marcus and Lawrence together and happy at times might have been nice before he set off on his expedition. Still, there you go. Look at me. I'm always looking for an opportunity.
Absolutely.
related to that, you just reminded me, of course, that this is one of the ones that got the omnibus repeat treatment in, I think, after this summer. It was a cut down, so I'm not sure whether this is anything. Whether anyone knows whether they have the notes. I mean, obviously on Seeds of Doom they were able to reconstruct.
I'm sure they must have something, whether it be an off-air, even an off-air audio would be enough for them to rebuild it.
It would be rather interesting to see. I'd be interested to see the cut-down version.
Wonder if the director or producer are involved. That's normally the criterion for whether or not they think it counts as a valid artistic object in its own right that we could see reconstructed on a Blu-ray.
It's a 1 hour omnibus, apparently.
Oh, right.
Oh, right.
So, which I probably saw.
I didn't know they were that cut down.
What were you going to say, Gav?
Just a minor curiosity. When I finally watched the DVD version, having known the VHS Inside Out, it was a really strange experience getting 2 or 3 extra seconds in 2 or 3 places in the DVD that I'd never seen before, because they're just these completely trivial trims in the VHS version, as well as the credits, obviously. So that when they're decoding the message through the Marconi scope, and I just remember watching the DVD for the first time, and the doctor says, "This repeats very often in this sentence. We'll call that the letter E, the most common letter in your alphabet." It just blew my mind. I've never heard a reference to the letter E in Pyramids of Mars before.
Yeah.
It's just these strange, really arbitrary little chops. And I think is the one bit where they're jumping out of a window. I think that was one of the bits taken out of the... I mean... Oh, and I think the only other bit I remember is one of the puzzles. I don't think we see the electric shock. The doctor nearly gets an electric shock from the button before he presses the right button. That's out. That's gone from the VHS. And that must have totaled about 15 seconds. I don't know. It's very strange, unless my memory's failing me, which it probably is.
Talking of the decoding, isn't the entire message that he decodes "Beware Sutekh"? Is there anything more to it than that? Because that's quite a feat to E is the most common letter, but to apply that logic to 12, 13 letter message is quite some feat of cryptography. It's
not very helpful.
Yes, exactly. It's not exactly.
If you train your radio telescopes
I'm here,
at
Abe
Mars.
Slaney.
Yes.
Anyway, it's nice that they chose to write it in English anyway.
Oh, good point. Yes.